The history of gun control in the United States of America is embodied by a climate of fear and necessity. At all points, you can go back and look at the absolute events unfolding, and those clamoring for gun control will point to a crisis. They'll point for immediate necessity. Let's start from the genesis, from the very beginning, before the United States was even a country. We were just colonies of Great Britain, the mother country, who wished to impose its will against the English Constitution, against the so-called subjects of the colonies. One need look no further than Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. Because the British had come in and hammered the United States so heavily with taxes and also literally unjust laws that prevented a lot of the colonists, especially in Massachusetts, from doing certain things, colonial militia started training. They knew that the British were going to even become more heavy-handed. So the colonists started training in the Massachusetts countryside. They started drilling. They started becoming proficient with their arms. They started storing gunpowder. They started storing food and supplies. And when the British marched into Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775, they were met with a surprise. But make no mistake about it. You've all heard "One if by land, two if by sea," Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the famous poem. But what's often missed in that is why the British were doing this to begin with. Well, I'll tell you why. They had two missions on that. The first one was that they were trying to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The second reason was that they were to confiscate the colonists' militias, arms and gunpowder and other supplies. That's why they were doing that. All right, that's just one instance. That's the beginning of gun control. Let's go even further. All right, especially after the war between the states. A lot of states tried to enact black codes to prevent black Americans from owning firearms. Why? Because they didn't want them to fight back against things that were going wrong. Another reason, same thing as the British. All right, let's go even further. And of course, let's go to the first federal gun control law. This one's the big boy, ladies and gentlemen. You really want to know where the true genesis of gun control in the United States is? Look no further than the National Firearms Act of 1934. Franklin Roosevelt was president then, and much like his progressive cronies, he wanted to pretty much make a new era for the United States of America, right? You've got to tear down the past to build the present, according to these people, okay? If you don't like it, I really don't care. It's the truth. You have to get rid of tradition. You have to get rid of everything that the country is built on. What is more American than firearms, all right? And in his presidency, of course, let's think about this. At the beginning of 1934, there was an assassination attempt on President Roosevelt with a handgun. Okay, so because he had an assassination attempt on him with a handgun, it would make sense to pass the National Firearms Act of 1934. This is the first federal gun control law. And what it did is that it taxed fully automatic and gangster-style weapons. Does that sound familiar? Gangster-type weapons? It wasn't assault weapons back then, it was gangster-type weapons. So because a crime with a handgun had taken place, would it not make sense to the progressives to do this and ban all full auto and to tax all full auto and gangster type weapons? It makes perfectly logical sense, right? And so they also put in the FBI background checks and also needed to update the local law enforcement of people who were buying these weapons. All right, the tax was $200. Back then, that was a lot of money. Given the annual median household income was about $2,000. So about a tenth of what people made in a year just to get this tax for this. That's your first federal firearms, that's your first federal gun control law. Look, we move forward, the Federal Firearms Act of 1938. So instead of the National Firearms Act, now it's the Federal Firearms Act of 1938. Gun sellers had to get a license from the IRS. Yeah, the IRS you have to get a license from them to conduct business if you wanted to sell guns. You have to get a special license from the Internal Revenue Service. Not that the IRS has ever been used to bully anybody who didn't agree with the administration. That's just a completely foreign concept to the United States of America. So now it also required these people to maintain records of sales. That's what the Federal Firearms Act of 1938 did. So not only do you have to get a special license to sell guns, but you also had to maintain sales records as well. And this was sold in Congress. This was sold as an act to prevent felons from buying guns. That was the whole overt reason, but the covert reason is to use business to regulate gun sellers. There's always an overt and a covert reason for these things, right? There's using the crisis, and then there's what you really want to push through. All right, let's go to 1939, the famous Supreme Court case, Miller United States versus Miller. Now this is profound. And if you go back and look at this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that the shotgun in this case in question was of no military use and therefore could be taxed. All right? So the argument here was that if a gun doesn't have military use, it could be taxed. It only enhances the Second Amendment of the United States that guns were designed for military or common defense purposes and individual rights. All right? So this court case ruled that a sawed-off shotgun was not a military weapon and therefore could be regulated under the Federal Firearms Act. So I guess that's up to you to determine, is this a pro-Second Amendment ruling or an anti-Second Amendment ruling? I'll leave that up to you, but it's nonetheless important to have here. We'll go to the other big boy, the other major leap forward in terms of gun control in the United States. So the first one was the National Firearms Act of 1934. The second one is the Gun Control Act of 1968. Once again, under the climate of fear, the climate of immediate necessity, you'd had a whole slew of assassinations in the 1960s, one of the most major, of course, being the President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, otherwise known as JFK in 1963. And then you also had Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy in 1968. My point being here, folks, is that what this did is this regulated imported guns. The Gun Control Act of 1968 started to regulate imported guns coming from other countries, all right? It also required more licensing from people that wanted to get guns. All right. It also banned any mail order guns and ammunition. Okay, this is back in 1968, of course. So no more mail order guns, no more ammunition. And what it also did is it raised the age of people that needed to buy guns as well. So the Gun Control Act of 1968 was pretty egregious to gun owners. All right, this is a major leap forward in terms of violating Second Amendment rights. I just wanted to make you aware of this. And here's also an interesting footnote from the Gun Control Act of 1968. This is when the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, currently known as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, what also happened from this is that this is when the ATF split off from the IRS. It was originally a revenue agency. The whole purpose was to get revenue, all right? So ATF broke off from the IRS and started operating completely on its own under the Department of Justice because they wanted to become more effective and they wanted to enforce laws more vigorously, right? You can start to see there are probably some serious issues that happen from this, as we'll cover here. Moving forward into the 80s, you know, the 80s is often seen as a conservative decade, so-called conservative decade with the Reagan presidency. But in 1987, what you had is the Firearms Owners Protection Act. Originally, this was supposed to do exactly what it did. It was supposed to protect firearms from a lot of the absolutely ridiculous laws of the 1968 Gun Control Act. But what you have is that, and what spurred this bill, what spurred this act was, in 1982, the Senate of the United States of America did an inquiry into the effects of this Gun Control Act, and what they found was that 75% of people that were prosecuted under the Gun Control Act of 1968 had no criminal intent or knowledge. Like 75% of these people were killed by bureaucracy and red tape. So they had no criminal intent whatsoever. So there needed to be some serious reform. Hence the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1987. This bill was supposed to go, what it was supposed to do was that it was supposed to roll back and loosen a lot of those restrictions from the one of 1968. What happened though was that in the middle of the deliberation of the bill, there was something added to this bill called the Hewes Amendment. And what the Hewes Amendment did was it effectively banned machine guns from everyday normal citizens. Now it's very, very expensive to own a machine gun because you can't import any of these. What it did is it effectively banned them. And the messed up thing about this was that this was done by a voice vote. This was done by a voice vote. This wasn't done by a recorded vote. Actually, there's a huge clamor for a recorded vote on this, but Charlie Rangel, Mr. New York himself, what he did was he just went through with it and pushed it through the House anyway. And of course, the Senate adopted it. So what you have now is the Hewes Amendment under what was originally supposed to be a very good, or at least a rollback of draconian gun laws of the 1968 one. What you have now is an effective ban on machine guns that was slid into the legislation at the last minute. Kind of typical of Washington, D.C., but nonetheless, I wanted you to become aware of this, because how do we know where gun control came from unless we follow it, unless we track its so-called progress? But what I really think it is horrific. We go to the 1990s. In the year 1990, of course, you have the Gun-Free School Act, which absolutely is a federal law. The Gun-Free Schools Act of 1990, and what that did was prohibit or prevent any firearms from being carried or fired within 1,000 feet of a school. This is supposed to be on a federal level, but of course it was overruled in 1995 by the Supreme Court. But a lot of this is still with us. You see schools, gun-free zones, gun-free zones, gun-free zones. Moving forward to 1994, you have what's called the Brady Law. Right, the Brady Law required, of course, background checks and a mandatory waiting period by local law enforcement. So if you wanted to get a gun, not only did you have to go through a federal database, but you had to go through local law enforcement background check and have a mandatory waiting period. Once again, in 1997, this was struck down as well. The local law enforcement background check was struck down, but the waiting periods in many states were not. Okay, and it's with us in many ways. I think in California, you got a 10-day waiting period. Yeah, that's insane. I know Illinois got a 3-day one on some guns, and I don't even know what New England has. I don't know what they do, but what I'm saying, folks, is that you see the progression. You see the progression of this, and it's accelerating. But here's the third major leap forward. We already talked about 1934 National Firearms Act, 1968 Gun Control Act. In 1994, you have what's called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This is the big boy, all right? What this did was it banned over a dozen, probably closer to 24 types of firearms and features on those firearms. Things like flash hiders, collapsible butt stocks, bayonet lugs, things like that. And it banned many of those types of firearms. In addition to that, you had magazine restriction. This is nationwide. This is all across the country. This isn't just at the state level. This is a nationally binding law. Okay. What you also had was magazine restrictions. Okay. You couldn't have more than 10 rounds for pistol or a rifle. Okay, except the military and law enforcement. They could have magazines of more than 10 rounds because they need them more than an average citizen, was the rationale. And of course, if you were under 21, can't purchase a handgun. All right, that was the effects of that one. And it's that's the big boy. That's a bad one. And living through those times, it wasn't that long ago. If we remember back, during those 10 years, it was pretty bad. I mean, people were not real happy that we're gonna. Unfortunately, it sunsetted in 2004, so we don't have to live with that anymore, okay? Moving forward to 1996, what you had is that anyone convicted of domestic violence could no longer possess or own a firearm, okay? That was another one. And moving forward, of course, even recently, I mean, we've had, some events happen to us recently within the past 2-3 years where you've seen a big push towards more gun control. Of course, it hasn't happened on a national level, but certain states certainly have. The whole point of this video is to show you the history of gun control, and it's always executed out of a climate of fear or some catastrophic incident that happens, but people never stop to realize what are the ramifications of us doing this. And at what cost? It's really odd to me that those that are willing to take away rights from others have never served their country in any capacity. What I'm saying is that the people that want to strip away your rights have no fundamental knowledge of this country's history, its heritage, its constitution, or anything else. Firearms to the Americans it's our very soul, and because it symbolizes freedom, it symbolizes your ability to own and protect your own life. And anybody that advocates taking away firearms from anybody, you know what? As far as I'm concerned, I don't consider you my countrymen at all. And if this video stirs up people, I hope it does, because I'm really tired of people talking about taking away my property and the property of millions of other people. You know how many guns there are in this country? Over 300 million. And as of 2007, the Department of Justice said that there were 294 million guns in the United States of America. That was 2007, before our current president. And I can imagine it's a whole heck of a lot more now. You got over 100 million handguns, 100 million rifles, almost 100 million shotguns in people's possession. And I'll tell you something, folks. This is something that I'm very proud of. This is something I'm very proud of, that Americans are one of the most heavily armed societies on earth. I'm proud of that statement. And I don't really think we have to fear about being invaded anytime soon. This is Reid Henrichs reminding you that the lessons that we learned are written on the tombstones of others.